My name is Valeria Luiselli. I was born in Mexico City and I'm the author of Sidewalks, a book of personal essays, and Faces in the Crowd, a novel. I grew up in South Korea, South Africa and India, and I've been living now in New York City in Harlem for about 3 or 4 years. One of the ways that I started really inhabiting Mexico City was when I got a Chinese bicycle in Belize and brought it back to Mexico City, and that's when I started really feeling that I had a viewpoint that engaged me in a way that I was comfortable with. The difference between flying in an airplane, walking, and riding a bicycle is the same as that between looking through a telescope, a microscope, and a movie camera. Each allows for a particular way of seeing. From an airplane, the world is a distant representation of itself. On 2 legs, we are condemned to a plethora of microscopic detail. But the person suspended over 2 wheels, a meter above the ground, can see things as if through the lens of a movie camera. He can linger on details and choose to pass over what is unnecessary. Faces in the Crowd is a novel which is told in 4 different times and by 2 different narrators. The first narrator is a woman, probably in her early 40s, with 2 children in a house in Mexico City and a husband whom she's slowly drifting apart from. And the other narrator is a Mexican poet who in fact existed and lived in New York in the 1920s. His name was Gilberto Owen. He narrates almost from his deathbed in the 1950s, and he tells the story of his youth in New York, as does the woman narrator, the first narrator, who tells the story of her youth in New York when she was working in a publishing house and trying to sort of find the new Bolaño. And she comes across Gilberto Owen's poetry. He recorded the minute details of his everyday life in Harlem, which was the neighborhood that I had arrived to. And it was a neighborhood that didn't have any sort of depth for me. I had just arrived, I was a newcomer to it. And his letters became a sort of mirror for my own experience of the neighborhood and gave that neighborhood a sense of depth that it didn't have. I started writing a novel from the viewpoint of Gilberto Owen, sort of trying to record and imagine that area in the 1920s. At some point, I got married, I became pregnant, I planted a tree, and the rest of the cliches attached to growing up. When I finally went through the phase of pregnancy, which was for me a very traumatizing phase because I didn't write, I didn't read, I didn't even watch movies, I just slept basically. When I finally got through that, I started writing again, and I took out this material from the archives I had, but it didn't seem as alive as it had once seemed. It sort of seemed absurd to carry on writing as if nothing had happened. So I had to find a viewpoint and a different tone to somehow go back into that material, and I started intervening in it. I used to live in Morningside Park, around that area, when I started writing the novel, which is precisely the area where Owen used to live in the 1920s. From what he says in his letters, the neighborhood, architecturally speaking, hasn't changed much. Harlem was going through a transition in those years from being an upper class, sort of white bourgeois area. It had just become a black neighborhood where there was a lot going on, so it was the middle of the Harlem Renaissance. And there were a few Mexican and Latin American and Spanish writers, artists arriving to Harlem. The case that is very well known is that of Garcia Lorca, who came to New York in those years and wrote his book of poems, Poet in New York. So Owen was in this milieu where he was a Mexican living in New York in the 1920s. There was something exotic and strange about Owen where he didn't quite fit in to the circle of black intellectuals and writers, but was definitely not accepted by the circles of white intellectuals and writers. So there was this in-betweenness, and that I try to explore both spatially and in terms of the narrative in the book. I decided to go look for his house in a sort of journalistic spree, maybe, or it was, I guess it was just more a burst of enthusiasm that took me out into the street to confirm that this address that was written in this old letter in the 1920s actually existed. So I went and I looked for the apartment building, and it was there, and there was a man going into the apartment building, and sort of I just followed him, not really knowing what to expect or where to stop. And at some point he went into his house and I just walked up and up and up until I reached the terrace. I went out into the terrace, and I didn't spend a night on the rooftop, as I say in the novel. That would have been almost impossible. I think that I've consciously explored not only spaces, but the possibility of building and inhabiting spaces as I write. I had the idea for Faces in the Crowd while riding the subway in New York. And there's a moment that I really like, which is when two subway trains go at the same speed on different tracks for a little while. People on parallel cars are just engaged in their own solitary activities. And I have a moment of voyeurism. I've always really liked a story that Ezra Pound told, where his poem, The Apparition of These Faces in the Crowd, Petals from a Wet Black Bough, comes from. It's a very short imagist poem where I actually take the title of the book from. He wrote that poem after having thought he had seen a friend who had already died in the subway amidst the crowd, and then having that person disappear in front of him. And he explains how he writes his very long poem and then cuts line after line until he only has these two lines. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough.